Hello there, Michelle Short here. Today I'm creating a circle shaped card using Debossing and the Lush Elegance suite of products. So let's get started. This is the Lush Elegance suite. So I'm using the stamp set, the coordinating stencils and the coordinating dies. There is a press and foil plate set as well. I'm not using that today, but I do just want to mention that it is part of the suite. I'm going to use the floral image from the stamp set today. So I'm going to stamp that down onto some white cardstock. I have placed my white cardstock inside of the MISTI and then I'm placing the stamp on top. I can close the MISTI door to pick up that stamp and then I can ink it up using detail black ink. So I'm just going to ink up this stamp really well. I love that the floral image is all kind of on one stamp set, so you can stamp all of the flowers in one go and then you can add the ink blending all in one go and then you can do the die cutting all in one go. So just inked up that image and then I can close the MISTI door to transfer that ink onto the cardstock. My ink pad is a little bit on the dry side, so I'm not going to get a great impression the first time round, and that is the great thing about using a stamp positioner. You can stamp it multiple times and make sure that you get a really nice impression of that ink. So I'm just inking this image up again and then I can stamp it down again, and I think I did it 3 times in the end just to make sure that that black outline was really nice, dark and crisp. I can then bring in the coordinating stencils. So I've held my panel of cardstock down onto my craft mat using some low tack tape. I can start off with the first stencil and I can line that up with the image, and I'm lining up those leaves. I can then bring in some more low tack tape and hold that down onto the cardstock and my craft mat. There are a few different ways that you can hold down stencils while doing ink blending. You can use sticky mats and things like that, but for these stencils I do tend to opt for holding them down with some low tack tape. So I'm going to start off by adding my lightest shade to these leaves, and this is Fresh Pear. I'm using a 1-inch blending brush. So I'm loading up my brush with that ink and then bringing it to the stencil, and that's going to colour in those leaves. And I'm just doing a base layer of these leaves to start with this colour. And you can see here that I'm moving my blending brush in lots of different ways. I want to make sure that I'm getting all of the areas of this stencil. If you just go in one direction with the ink blending, you may miss some areas of the image. So I just want to make sure that I'm going in all different directions with that blending brush. I can now remove that low tack tape that's holding down that stencil, and I am going to reuse this tape multiple times. I can then lift off that stencil and I've coloured in the base layer of those leaves. I can now bring in the second stencil, which is the base layer of the flowers. So again, just lining that stencil up with the black lines of the image, holding that down with some low tack tape. And now I can bring in the blue for the flowers, and I'm using a Slumber. Again, I'm using a 1-inch blending brush, and I want this to be a fairly even kind of layer of ink. I'm not doing any shading on this image, I'm just doing the shading that comes with the stencils, but you could definitely go in and do lots of shading here if you wanted to. I do often do that and I just use the base layer of the stencils rather than the detailed layer, but for today I just wanted some really nice flat colour, but layering it up with the detail layers of that stencil. I can now go in with that detail layer for the flowers, and for this I'm using Sapphire ink. This is in the same colour family as Slumber, but I have missed out one shade in between, so I'm going for a slightly darker shade just to make sure that I've got that variation of colour and that you can really see it nicely. When these inks dry, they do fade a little bit and lighten up because they kind of smooth out onto that cardstock. So I want to make sure that I go in with quite a few layers of this colour, make sure that those centres are really dark. I can now go in with the next layer, and this colours in the buds of the flowers and also the flower centres. So I'm going back to that Slumber colour, and again I'm using that 1-inch blending brush. And again, I'm trying to do a fairly flat layer of colour, but if some of the buds are a little bit darker than the others, I'm not too concerned at this point. I'm then going in with Sapphire again, and I'm just going to colour in the centres of those flowers. And I am going to go over these multiple times just to get a really nice dark saturation of that colour. And then for the detail layer on the leaves, I'm using Key Lime, and again it's the same colour family as the Fresh Pear, but I've just missed out a shade in between. And this time I'm going in with a 1/2-inch blending brush because these areas are a lot smaller. I wanted to make sure that I'm getting into all of those tiny little areas of that stencil, and I just thought a smaller brush would be a little bit easier. So just making sure that I'm going over all of those areas and I get a nice definition of this shade on top of the base layer. And again, going in multiple directions with that blending brush. I can then remove that stencil and my colouring is complete for those flowers. And I think they look really pretty with the blues and the greens. I can now bring in the coordinating Lush Elegance die set, and I'm using the coordinating die for this image. I'm holding it down with some low tack tape, and then I can run that through my die cutting machine. And I'm just trying to get a slight even border around those images with that white cardstock. I can then pop out all of those images and then pop out those middle pieces using my embellishment tool. I'm only using 2 of the images today, but I'm going to keep the others for another project. I want to now work on my card base, and I wanted to create a circle shaped card, but I thought it'd be quite nice to do something a little bit extra rather than just a circle shape. So I'm using the Embroidery Hoops dies, and I've cut the largest one 3 times from white cardstock. I now want to have a base layer to the embroidery hoop, so I'm going to create a card base using the double stitched circle dies, and that happens to just be the exact same size as that large embroidery hoop, the largest die in that set. I want to add a little bit of texture onto my card base, so I'm going to go in and deboss the Trellis cover plate on top. You can do this with any die cutting machine. I am using the Platinum 6 today, so I've got my platform base, the platform top. I'm then going in with that grey silicone mat. You want something that's got a little bit of give to it, so a silicone mat is really great for that. I've got my panel of cardstock there that's cut into the circle, and now I'm placing the trellis die on top, cut side down. I'm trying to line it up so that it's even on, I'm going to say all 4 sides. Obviously this is a circle shape, so it doesn't have the corners or the sides, but you know what I mean. I'm trying to make it so that it's even on each of those sides, and then I can bring in a piece of scrap paper. This is absolutely not necessary for this sandwich, but I tend to do it, and then I can place my top plate on top, which is the D adapter plate. I can then run that through my die cutting machine, and that silicone mat is going to give some resistance underneath the die, and it's going to make it so that it doesn't actually cut through and die cut it like you ordinarily would. It's going to leave an impression in that cardstock, so it's going to actually deboss that cardstock. So I can just remove those plates, and then I can lift off that die, and you can see that that lovely pattern is created onto the cardstock. So this side here is the debossed side, and then the other side of this circle will be the embossed side, and you can use either one, but I am using the debossed side today. I can then bring in my first embroidery hoop. I can add some liquid glue around the outside edges of that, and then I can adhere that down onto my textured piece here, and I'm just trying to line it up so that the top of the hoop is in line with that kind of trellis pattern there. Once I'm happy, I can press that down, and because I'm adhering down onto such a textured piece, I am going to bring in my glass blocks here, and that's going to hold that piece down while the glue dries. Make sure that it's going to stick down really nicely. Once that's stuck down, I can bring in my flowers here and I can work out my arrangement. So I'm just popping a flower on either side, and then I have Stamped a Sentiment from the Lush Elegance stamp set, and I'm using my reverse tweezers to kind of hover that in place so that I can see where I want to arrange everything. So that's a really great way just to keep something kind of hovered in place, and you can adhere things down around it. So I can now add some foam squares onto the back of my first flower here. So I'm adding these onto the pieces that are going to overlap where the actual embroidery hoop is, rather than the outside edge, because I am going to keep these overhanging. I really like having things overhanging card bases. I know that it's not for everyone, but especially with a smaller card like this, you can find an envelope that will fit it really easily, either a square envelope or a normal A2 sized envelope. So I'm just figuring out there where I wanted to add some extra foam squares. I can remove the backings off of those foam squares, and then I can add some liquid glue where it's going to overlap where that embroidery hoop kind of is, or sort of inside of that embroidery hoop, if that makes sense. I want to make sure that not only do I not want to see glue on the back of these pieces from the back, I also want to be able to lift them up so that I can add the other layers of that embroidery hoop kind of underneath them. So I'm just sticking down that piece there at the bottom because I know that I'm going to cut that off where the stem is, and then I can bring in that other one. I can then add some foam squares onto the back of this piece here. I'm going to cut some of these foam squares down as well so that they're a little bit smaller. And again, just bringing that back to the hoop, just making sure that I've got the kind of lift of the foam squares where I want them to be. And then add some liquid glue just where that stem is. And then I can pop that in place. So I can now remove my reverse tweezers with my sentiment on. That's done that job for me. I can just press that down, make sure that that glue is going to dry really nicely, especially on where that stem is. And then I can cut off the bottom pieces that are overlapping where the stem is. And I thought at this point I would keep that leaf there because I thought it looked really pretty, but then I realised once I go to add the hoop on top that it's just not going to work. So I'm just lifting up those leaves so that I can pop the other layers of the embroidery hoop underneath. Now in my head this was the easiest way to do it at the time. In my last video, I shared how to do a similar thing with a frame, and I should have just done it the same way. I should have just cut off the bottoms and layered up the hoops first and then layered the flowers on top. But for some reason, I decided not to do it that way, and instead I'm kind of pushing them underneath. To be honest, I don't think it really matters too much. This worked absolutely fine, but it was a little bit more fiddly. So I've placed that first layer of the hoop on top. I can then add some small dabs of glue there to adhere this kind of little nail piece that holds that hoop together. And then I can add some more liquid glue onto the back of this top hoop piece. And then again, I can kind of pop that underneath those leaves. And then because I'm using that liquid glue, I've got time to just wiggle it in place. And I decided not to go back and add more glue behind those leaves. I absolutely could have done, but once I'd pressed them down, they kind of held in place absolutely fine. Now at this point, I think it looks really pretty as a tag, and I definitely could just add my other layer of the circle on the back and then add some twine through the top, and I think that that would look really pretty. Or I could just add this onto a regular card base if I wanted to, but I decided that I would quite like to make it into a circle shaped card. So I've got my other circle here, and I'm just cutting a small amount off the bottom of this panel, and that's going to help make the card stand up nicely. I can then bring it to my scoring board, and I'm just going to make a score line towards the top. That's going to create a hinge so that I can hinge it onto the front panel of the card. There are two different ways that you could do this. You could either have it so that the nice side was facing the back of the card, or you can do it so the nice side is facing the inside of the card where you write your personal message. I tend to do it so that the inside of the card looks nice, but you could definitely add another panel onto the back of this one if you wanted to make sure that the back of it looks nice as well. And you could also do that on the inside of the card. I do think that that embossing on the back of this panel looks really nice on the back of the hoop, so I'm going to keep it as is because like I said, I think that looks quite pretty. I can then add some double-sided tape onto that hinge. And then I'm going to use the grid lines on my craft mat to make sure that this piece is straight. I can then hold my front piece over the top and try and line up the top of the hoop as straight as possible as well. And then once I'm happy, I can press that down. I can then remove that low tack tape. And then just make sure that that hinge is really stuck down nicely. And if I need to, I can kind of move it around at this point before I press that down. And then I can just reinforce that hinge, make sure that it's going to stand up nicely. I have then die cut another layer from the sentiment. And I'm just going to use that just as a little bit of extra dimension where it overlaps the flowers. So I can add my stamped one on top, just wiggle it in place and try and line them up as best as possible. And then I can add some more foam squares onto the side where it's not going to overlap the flowers. So just bringing that to the card there, I can see where it needs another foam square. So just adding a couple more on there. I can remove the backings off of those foam squares, and then I can adhere that down onto the card, and I'm just trying to line it up as straight as possible. It is always a little bit difficult, I find, with circle cards. I wasn't quite happy with the placement, so I just lifted that up a little bit, and then once I'm happy I can press that down. And then to finish off, I'm going to embellish with some sky blue clear drops. So just adding some small dabs of glue and then using my embellishment tool to pick those up and place them down. So just adding 2 towards the bottom, 2 towards the top, and then 1 there on that right hand side as well. And so that is the card finished for today. I really love that it's in the shape of an embroidery hoop. I think that's something a little bit different. And then you've got that lovely debossed detail of the trellis in the background. Kind of if the flowers were kind of growing up that trellis. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.